All right. Good evening, family. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This is our first episode in 2025 of Streets to the Statehouse. For those who are not familiar with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, we're a grassroots think tank, revolutionary Pan-African nationalists. We advocate explicitly for Black people in Baltimore and the state of Maryland, and that's where the majority of our work is done. And so that's a perspective that we bring. So really the importance and the purpose really of this podcast is to provide our base, to provide the community with an opportunity to get a perspective on what's happening in the state legislature from a kind of Black radical perspective. And so that's one of the things that we offer and one of the reasons why we do this podcast. I'm gonna say a little bit more about Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle for those who aren't familiar. I just mentioned that we're a grassroots political advocacy organization and think tank. And it's important for people to note that we are not a nonprofit, we're an LLC. And that means that we can directly confront the political establishment without having to say, you know, this is nonpartisan, right? We can be very explicit about our political perspective, and we can be explicit about those who need to be politically confronted by the community. And so a big part of the nature of the work that we do is to provide the community the information it needs to hold their elected officials accountable, to put electeds in check that are engaged in policy making that is detrimental to our community, and lift up those that are champions for our community. So that's just kind of a general sense of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. And again, the purpose of this podcast. What we're going to do tonight is I'm going to give a general overview of the Maryland General Assembly 2025. I'm going to talk a little bit about our specific legislative agenda. I'm going to talk about some other issues that are going to emerge that we think are going to be important issues during the 2025 Maryland General Assembly. And then we're going to end with Lawrence Grandpre, our Director of Research, who's going to delve deep into some hearings that happened, some hearings where the Secretary of the Department of Juvenile Services came before the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. And he's going to do an analysis both of the media coverage of those hearings and the political, and then the actual hearings would happen, and then talk about just some of the political impact that has on a major area of our legislative agenda on juvenile justice. But with that, so let me just start by giving an overview. Let me actually start, before I even give an overview of the Maryland General Assembly, I want to just take a few moments to talk a little bit about a recent development. You know, one of the people that you've heard from this podcast and from LBS for many years is the work of now former Senator Jill P. Carter. And so, you know, I'm sure many people who are listening to this podcast are aware that as of January 3rd, she resigned from her seat, 20 years of service to the 41st Legislative District of Northwest Baltimore. And so I just want to take a few minutes to talk about that, because if you've listened to this before, you've heard that many of the legislative efforts that we've engaged in, she was, you know, the lead sponsor. So whether it's around juvenile justice, whether it's around reparations, whether it's around police accountability, you know, she in many ways is unquestionably one of the most radical and committed legislators to Black liberation that we've seen in the state of Maryland. And I would say I would put her up against any state representative around the country in terms of pushing, you know, many of the issues that she's advocated for. And I think it's important to note that she dealt with significant pushback. You know, in many ways, I've talked to people over the past few weeks, you know, since her resignation, and people will say that she was ahead of her time. And there were real political consequences that came as a result of stances that she took before it was popular to do so. One of the things you've heard us mention pretty regularly is the mass arrest, zero tolerance policy of former Mayor Martin O'Malley, who between 1999 and 2006, there were 757,000 illegal arrests made in Baltimore, so much so that the NAACP and ACLU of Maryland sued Baltimore and won for the illegal arrest that happened in 2006. And so that just, you know, and so she was, you know, advocating for Black people at a time when Martin O'Malley, as a, you know, white mayor of a Black city, was in many respects a person who the Democratic Party invested a lot in kind of his persona and political career. And so there were Black people who had an investment in his political career in such a way that many of them would not touch, particularly the issue that then Delegate Joe Carter was dealing with in pushing back against mass arrests. And so now many of the things that she had been pushing for years ago have now become more popular as it relates to, expungements, as it relates to juvenile justice, automatic charging, ending the practice of automatic charging against adults, something that we'll talk about, later on. Things around community oversight of law enforcement. These are, lead paint poisoning. These are many of the issues that, that are now getting additional traction, and legislators are able to take up those causes with much less threat to their political careers, as Senator Carter had to endure. So I just want to take, just the first few moments to just, give the, respects to a mentor of mine, Senator Carter, and the work that she's done. And that, the hope of the work of LBS and other legislators that have come into the legislature to take up the mantle and to advance the cause for Black people in the way that she did as a representative in the Maryland State Senate and the Maryland House of Delegates. So just wanted to start with that. One of the things that I did not plan on talking about, and I will talk about briefly, is that there was a vote yesterday. In the light of her resignation, the State Central Committee has to come together to vote for her replacement to finish out the remainder of her term. And, it's no secret that, I'm on the Democratic Party State Central Committee. And so, there was a vote yesterday where Delegate Dahlia Attar will take the seat for the remainder of the term that Senator Carter vacated. Without getting too much into it, there are a lot of us who, wanted a different outcome. And this isn't a slight to Delegate Attar. She's, has always been very pleasant and nice to me, and someone that, to the extent that I've interacted with her, interactions have been great. But in terms of political agenda, it's not the person that, that I voted for. And in terms of, so what I will say, because this isn't entirely the appropriate platform to go in detail about this, but I would be remiss without saying that one of the challenges we have as a community is that we're not clear about the importance of putting people in office that advance our collective interest. That when we think about, and I've written about this, right, that there is a, Zionist political perspective that we have represented in the 41st district, that is conservative on many of the issues that I'm going to talk about today. And in many respects, when you think about the connection between that and some of the things that we've talked about in terms of Sinclair broadcasting and the constant propaganda, criminalizing Black people, denigrating Black-led organizations that receive money from the public sector, denigrating Black-led organizations that are engaged in addressing community violence, demonizing the policy demand of reparations. These are the things that Sinclair Broadcasting, has put out. And it is clear to me that Zionist element has the support of Sinclair Broadcasting, or at least some alignment in terms of their agenda. And so it's extremely important as people of African descent that we need to, as a community, be clear that when we, take certain votes, we're voting for the purpose of advancing our collective interests as a people. And I think too often what happens is that there are Black people who are more interested in their own individual political, professional careers, as opposed to understanding the importance of your vote being a contribution to a larger struggle for freedom for Black people, right? And look, people get to have different perspectives. People get to, engage the political arena how they see fit. But those actions have consequences for our collective community. And we as a community have to begin to be more intentional about having a collective code as to how we engage the political arena, such that we can levy consequences against those that engage in political activity that's against our collective interests. So again, not the appropriate platform to go too deep into that. Those that are aware of what happened will be able to read in between the lines and know what we're talking about. And I'll probably find some other platform where it's more appropriate to go in detail about that. But again, it would be remiss if I didn't mention Senator Carter and her contributions to my work, to LBS's work, and to the work of advancing Black people's interests in the legislature. And again, it would be remiss if I didn't mention at all the proceedings yesterday as it relates to the 41st Legislative District. All right, so let's get to the overall assessment of the Maryland General Assembly. And I want to start with this overview, because and some of what I'm about to say are things that people have heard me say before, but are things that I think are important either for new people that are newly listening, but also important as it relates to understanding then how we're going to talk about some of the issues that we're going to address. So when we think about the connection between the federal 2024 general election, the fact that now Donald Trump is 47th president of the United States, and his kind of political perspective and ideology and rhetoric. And one of the things that myself, and I'm sure many folks who politically would be understood as kind of further to the left, is that the concern that we have is that the victory of Trump in the previous presidential election would essentially create the excuse for the Democratic Party, of which at its core, right, the kind of moderate corporate core of the Democratic Party, would give it an excuse to go further to the right. And there are Democrats who have, both nationally and locally, and you're going to hear one later on in this podcast, use the federal election and Trump's victory as a rationale to politically go further to the right. And, we're seeing, and I mentioned Sinclair Broadcasting. For those who aren't familiar, Sinclair Broadcasting, owned by David Smith, who also owns the Baltimore Sun. And that is important because Sinclair Broadcasting and David Smith have a very explicit political agenda, right? So, and when I talk about our political agenda, our legislative agenda for 2025, the connection between those will be very clear. But I'm mentioning that because we're even seeing the stories that they're putting out, in many respects, advancing the rhetoric that is testing the extent to which Maryland will be impacted by the federal administration on issues of immigration. And one of the things that we're going to probably do with our next podcast is talk to the folks that are advocates for immigrants to talk about some of the impacts that that's having on Maryland. One of the things that I want to, mention that relates to what we're going to talk about is the same argument about projecting, in our case, Black folks, people of African descent. In the case of immigrants, just people of color more broadly, are generally understood because of societal propaganda of white supremacy as being inherently criminal. And this is something that is, I think, a key aspect of the policymaking that we're going to be contending with in this current environment. And so, again, one of the impacts of the election of Donald Trump is that it gives Democrats an excuse to capitulate to that societal propaganda, right? To try to appease